Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief brought together a cast that mixed rising young actors with established Hollywood stars. Released in 2010, the film depended heavily on the charisma of its younger leads, especially Logan Lerman, while surrounding them with recognizable performers who gave the fantasy world a sense of scale and credibility. The casting strategy was important because the story had to introduce audiences to Greek mythology while still feeling like a modern teenage adventure. Logan Lerman played Percy Jackson, a teenager who discovers that he is the son of Poseidon. Before taking the role, Lerman had already built a strong reputation as a young actor. He appeared in films such as The Patriot, What Women Want, The Butterfly Effect, Hoot, and 3:10 to Yuma. He had also received praise for his dramatic work in the television series Jack and Bobby. By the time he became Percy Jackson, he was already seen as a talented young performer capable of handling both emotional material and large-scale action. Lerman brought a natural vulnerability to Percy. His performance helped sell the idea that Percy was an ordinary teenager suddenly thrown into a world of gods, monsters, and ancient prophecies. He also gave the character a more confident and mature personality than the younger Percy from the original novel. The film increased Lerman's international visibility and helped establish him as a leading actor. Soon afterward, he appeared in films such as The Three Musketeers and later earned major praise for the perks of being a wallflower. His career eventually moved toward more serious dramatic work, but Percy Jackson remained one of the projects that introduced him to a large global audience. Alexander Daddario played Annabeth Chase, the daughter of Athena and one of Percy's closest companions. Before the film, Daddario was best known for television work, particularly her role on All My Children. She had also appeared in several smaller film and television projects. The Lightning Thief became one of her first major Hollywood roles and exposed her to a much wider audience. Daddario's version of Annabeth was portrayed as confident, competitive, physically capable, and highly intelligent. She had to balance the character's warrior qualities with the growing friendship between Annabeth and Percy. Although the film changed several elements of Annabeth's personality and appearance from the books, Daddario became strongly associated with the role. The movie helped launch her film career and eventually led to more prominent parts in projects such as Texas Chainsaw 3D, San Andreas Baywatch, and The White Lotus. Her later success made The Lightning Thief an important early milestone in her career. Brandon T. Jackson played Grover Underwood, Percy's best friend and protector. Jackson had already gained attention through comedy, especially after appearing in Tropic Thunder, where he played Al Pacino. His comedic timing made him a natural choice for the film's version of Grover, who was significantly more confident and humorous than the character in the novel. Jackson brought much of the movie's comic energy. His Grover frequently uses jokes to reduce tension, especially during dangerous situations involving monsters and mythological creatures. The character was also given a more adventurous personality, allowing Jackson to combine physical comedy with action. The film increased his recognition with younger audiences and helped him continue working in mainstream comedy and entertainment. Jake Abel played Luke Castellan, the son of Hermes. Abel had already appeared in television series and films before joining Percy Jackson, including Supernatural and The Lovely Bones. Luke initially appears to be a helpful older camper who assists Percy, but he is eventually revealed as the main human antagonist responsible for stealing Zeus's lightning bolt. Abel's performance required him to shift from friendly mentor to bitter traitor. His relaxed and approachable personality during the early scenes makes the betrayal more effective because Percy sees Luke as someone he can trust. The role gave Abel greater exposure within fantasy and young adult entertainment. He later appeared in projects including I Am Number 4, The Host, and further television work, while also returning as Luke in the Percy Jackson sequel. Sean Bean played Zeus, king of the Greek gods. By 2010, Bean was already an internationally recognized actor, known for roles in GoldenEye, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, National Treasure, and numerous British television productions. His ability to portray authority and danger made him an effective choice for Zeus. Bean gives Zeus a stern and intimidating presence. The conflict over his stolen lightning bolt provides a central thread of the story, and Bean's performance makes the possibility of war between the gods feel serious. Although his screen time is limited, his reputation immediately gives the character importance. Pierce Brosnan played Chiron, the centaur who secretly works as Percy's teacher before revealing his true identity. Brosnan was already a major international star because of his years playing James Bond in films, including GoldenEye, Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and Die Another Day. He had also appeared in films such as The Thomas Crown Affair and Mamma Mia. Brosnan brought warmth and authority to Chiron. His presence helped establish the character as a mentor figure who understands both the human and mythological worlds. Casting a former James Bond also gave the film additional star power for adult audiences. Uma Thurman appeared as Medusa. By this point, Thurman was famous for films such as Pulp Fiction, Kill Bill, Gattaca, and Batman and Robin. Her casting transformed what could have been a simple monster encounter into one of the film's most memorable sequences. Thurman plays Medusa with a calm, seductive quality before revealing the character's deadly nature. Her performance mixes humor, menace, and theatrical exaggeration. Steve Coogan played Hades, bringing his distinctive comedic style to the ruler of the underworld. Rather than presenting Hades as purely frightening, Coogan portrays him as sarcastic, eccentric, and unpredictable. Rosario Dawson appeared as Persephone, giving the underworld scenes additional personality and humor. Catherine Keener played Percy's mother, Sally Jackson, providing the emotional foundation of Percy's journey and representing the normal life he is forced to leave behind. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief arrived in theaters in 2010 at a moment when Hollywood was searching aggressively for the next major young adult fantasy franchise. The enormous success of Harry Potter had demonstrated that stories involving teenagers, supernatural worlds, schools, quests, and continuing adventures could attract both younger audiences and adults. Percy Jackson entered this environment with an unusual advantage. Instead of building its fantasy entirely around invented mythology, it transformed ancient Greek legends into a modern adventure. This combination became one of the film's most recognizable cultural contributions. For many younger viewers, The Lightning Thief became an introduction to Greek mythology. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Athena, Hermes, Medusa, the Hydra, centaurs, satyrs, and other figures that might previously have been encountered mainly in schoolbooks were presented as characters in a contemporary fantasy universe. The film treated mythology as something that had survived into modern America, rather than as something belonging exclusively to the ancient world. Mount Olympus was placed above the Empire State Building. The entrance to the underworld appeared in Hollywood, and mythological creatures existed alongside cars, casinos, highways, and modern cities. This approach helped make classical mythology feel accessible to a generation growing up with fantasy franchises, video games, and superhero movies. Children and teenagers who discovered Percy Jackson through either the books or the film often became interested in learning about the original myths. The movie therefore occupied an unusual position between entertainment and informal education. It was never intended to be an accurate lesson in Greek mythology, but its characters and concepts encouraged many viewers to recognize names and stories that had existed for thousands of years. The film also participated in the growing popularity of the modern demigod hero. Percy is not simply someone who learns magic or receives extraordinary technology. His identity connects the ordinary world directly to ancient mythology. His supernatural abilities come from his relationship with Poseidon, while his personal struggles remain those of a teenager trying to understand where he belongs. This mixture of adolescence and legendary ancestry helped distinguish Percy Jackson from many other fantasy protagonists of the period. One particularly significant aspect of the story was its treatment of Percy's dyslexia and attention difficulties. Within the mythology of the story, characteristics that create problems for Percy in ordinary school are reinterpreted as signs of his demigod identity. His mind is naturally suited to ancient Greek, while his heightened awareness is connected to his ability to survive combat. The idea appealed strongly to young readers and viewers who felt different in traditional educational environments. Instead of presenting difference only as weakness, the story suggested that abilities could depend on context. However, the cultural reputation of the movie developed very differently from that of the original novel. Fans of Rick Riordan's book frequently criticized the adaptation for changing major elements. The characters were made older, important parts of the quest were altered, several characters received different personalities, and the larger mythology surrounding Kronos was greatly reduced. These differences became central to discussions about the film and eventually helped turn The Lightning Thief into a famous example of the difficulties involved in adapting popular young adult literature. Over time, criticism of the adaptation became part of Percy Jackson fandom itself. Online discussions frequently compared scenes from the movie with their equivalents in the novel. Fans joked about the characters' ages, the changes to Annabeth, the altered quests involving Persephone's pearls, and the movie's treatment of major mythology. The films developed a complicated reputation, in which some viewers enjoyed them as entertaining fantasy adventures, while dedicated book fans often treated them as deeply flawed adaptations. This divide became even more important years later, when Percy Jackson returned to the screen in a new television adaptation. Discussions surrounding the newer version repeatedly brought attention back to the 2010 movie. The earlier film became a reference point for debates about faithfulness, casting, pacing, character development, and how adaptations should handle beloved source material. In this sense, its cultural importance lasted much longer than its original theatrical release. The Lightning Thief also reflected a specific era of Hollywood filmmaking. During the late 2000s and early 2010s, studios increasingly searched for book series that could become multi-film franchises. Twilight, The Hunger Games, Divergent, and other adaptations would reinforce this trend. Percy Jackson belonged to the same industrial movement, demonstrating how valuable established young adult readerships had become to major studios. The film's mythology also fit comfortably with the growing dominance of superhero storytelling. Percy discovers that he possesses powers inherited through his parentage, learns to control them, joins other extraordinary young people, and eventually accepts a larger responsibility. Although the story comes from mythology rather than comic books, the structure has similarities to the superhero origin story that became increasingly dominant during the same period. Its cultural footprint can also be seen in continued recognition of specific scenes. The Lotus Casino sequence became particularly memorable because of its colorful atmosphere, music, and concept of characters becoming trapped in pleasure while losing awareness of time. Medusa's Garden Center, Percy's first experiences at Camp Half-Blood, and the confrontation involving the Hydra also remain recognizable images associated with the film. The movie did not create a major political movement or directly transform society, but cultural significance does not always depend on that kind of influence. Its importance comes largely from the way it connected ancient mythology with 21st century youth culture and participated in the expansion of young adult fantasy cinema. It introduced a large mainstream audience to the Percy Jackson universe and contributed to conversations about mythology, learning differences, identity, and literary adaptation. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief was a large-scale fantasy production designed to transform Rick Riordan's mythology-inspired novel into a major Hollywood adventure. The project was directed by Chris Columbus, a filmmaker with considerable experience creating fantasy stories for younger audiences. Columbus had previously directed Home Alone, Mrs. Doubtfire, and the first two Harry Potter films. His involvement immediately encouraged comparisons with Harry Potter, but Percy Jackson presented a different challenge. Instead of introducing audiences to a hidden magical society in Britain, the movie had to place ancient Greek gods and monsters inside recognizable modern American locations. The production reportedly had a budget of around $95 million, allowing the filmmakers to combine location photography, elaborate sets, stunt work, creature effects, and extensive computer-generated imagery. The movie needed to create everything from Camp Half-Blood and Mount Olympus to Medusa's lair and the underworld. Columbus approached the material primarily as a fast-moving adventure. This decision affected many aspects of production, including the decision to make the main characters older than they were in the original novel. Logan Lerman was approximately 17 while making the film, while Percy begins the novel as a 12-year-old. Alexander Daddario and Brandon T. Jackson were also older than the original versions of Annabeth and Grover. Aging the characters changed the atmosphere considerably. The film could emphasize action, attraction between Percy and Annabeth, driving across the country, and a greater degree of independence. It also allowed the production to move away from the feeling of a children's adventure and toward the teenage fantasy market that was extremely valuable at the time. Much of the production took place in British Columbia, Canada. Vancouver and surrounding areas provided many of the environments used to represent locations across the United States. Camp Half-Blood was created using the forests and landscapes of British Columbia, giving the camp a natural sense of isolation. The environment had to appear believable as both a summer camp and a secret training ground where young demigods could practice sword fighting, archery, and combat without attracting attention from the ordinary world. The filmmakers also used major American locations to establish the scale of Percy's journey. New York plays an especially important role because the entrance to Mount Olympus is located at the Empire State Building. The idea creates one of the movie's central visual contrasts. Ancient Greek civilization exists above one of the most famous modern skyscrapers in the world. Other parts of the adventure take Percy, Annabeth, and Grover to locations associated with Nashville, Las Vegas, Hollywood, and the American highway system. Creating the mythological creatures required a combination of physical performance and visual effects. Chiron was one of the most technically demanding characters because Pierce Brosnan's human upper body had to be integrated with the body of a horse. Medusa required a different kind of effect. Uma Thurman's performance supplied the character's face and physical presence, while her famous snake-covered hair was created digitally. The snakes needed to appear threatening, while remaining connected naturally to Thurman's movements. The Hydra sequence was another effects-heavy set piece. The creature needed multiple independently moving heads while interacting with the actors and environment. The filmmakers used the encounter as a major action sequence rather than simply reproducing events from the novel. This demonstrates one of the production's broader strategies. Recognizable mythological monsters were selected and arranged according to what would create exciting cinematic encounters, even when that required significant departures from the source material. One of the most distinctive sequences was the Lotus Casino. The location needed to communicate pleasure, confusion, and the disappearance of time. Bright lighting, games, music, food, and crowds created an environment where Percy and his friends could easily forget their mission. The sequence uses Lady Gaga's poker face, giving the scene a strongly contemporary identity. This choice firmly places a movie within the popular culture of 2010 and contrasts modern entertainment with the ancient mythology underlying the story. The underworld presented another major design challenge. Rather than portraying it simply as a dark cave or traditional ancient realm, the production created a huge environment filled with fire, rock, ruined structures, and crowds of dead souls. Steve Coogan's Hades added an unconventional tone. His appearance and personality made the ruler of the dead feel more like an eccentric rock star than the solemn mythological figure audiences might expect. This reflected the film's overall willingness to modernize Greek mythology rather than reproduce it literally. Mount Olympus required the opposite visual approach. It needed to appear majestic, bright, and almost impossibly grand. The production designed enormous classical structures above the Manhattan skyline, combining ancient Greek architecture with a modern urban setting. The scale of the gods was emphasized when Percy finally enters their presence. This allowed the climax to visually reinforce the difference between the human world Percy knows and the divine world responsible for his existence. Action preparation was another important part of production. The younger cast performed scenes involving sword fighting, running, wire work, and other physical choreography. Percy's confrontation with Annabeth during the Capture the Flag sequence was especially important because it had to introduce his developing abilities while establishing Annabeth as an experienced fighter. Water effects then became essential as Percy discovers that contact with water can heal him and increase his strength. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief follows the structure of a classical hero's journey transformed into a modern teenage fantasy adventure. The story begins with Percy Jackson living an apparently ordinary life while struggling at school and dealing with problems he cannot fully understand. He has dyslexia, difficulty concentrating, and a feeling that he does not belong. These early scenes establish Percy as an outsider before the movie reveals that the qualities making him different are connected to a hidden mythological identity. The central conflict is introduced almost immediately through the gods. Zeus confronts Poseidon and accuses Poseidon's son of stealing his master lightning bolt. Zeus demands its return before the summer solstice and threatens war if it is not recovered. Percy does not yet know that he is Poseidon's son, creating dramatic irony because the audience understands that the apparently ordinary teenager is already at the center of a potentially catastrophic conflict. Percy's first direct encounter with the supernatural occurs during a school trip when his substitute teacher transforms into a fury and attacks him. The incident destroys Percy's understanding of reality. His friend Grover and teacher Mr. Brunner clearly know more than they have admitted, but Percy receives little time to process what has happened. The narrative accelerates rapidly as Grover takes Percy and his mother Sally toward Camp Half-Blood. During the journey, they are attacked by the Minotaur. The sequence functions as Percy's first major threshold in the hero's journey. Sally appears to be killed by the creature, leaving Percy emotionally devastated. Percy then fights the Minotaur and manages to defeat it despite having almost no knowledge of his abilities. When he awakens inside Camp Half-Blood, his old life has effectively ended. At the camp, Percy learns that the Greek gods are real and that he is a demigod. Mr. Brunner reveals himself as Chiron, while Grover is revealed to be a satyr assigned to protect him. Percy meets Annabeth Chase, daughter of Athena, and Luke Castellan, son of Hermes. Camp Half-Blood acts as the narrative's training stage, allowing Percy to discover the rules of the mythological world while beginning to understand his own powers. The Capture the Flag sequence provides an important turning point. Percy initially struggles against more experienced demigods, particularly Annabeth. After entering water, however, his injuries heal and his strength increases. This confirms his identity as the son of Poseidon. The revelation gives Percy greater confidence, but also places him more directly inside the conflict involving Zeus's stolen lightning bolt. Percy's motivation changes when he learns that his mother is not truly dead. She has been taken to the underworld. Percy becomes determined to rescue her, even though Chiron does not approve of the mission. Luke helps Percy by providing equipment, including a shield and winged shoes. Percy, Annabeth, and Grover then leave Camp Half-Blood, transforming the middle section of the movie into a road adventure. The quest is organized around 3 pearls belonging to Persephone. Percy believes that collecting them will allow the group to escape from the underworld after rescuing Sally. This creates a clear 3-part objective and gives the middle of the film an episodic structure. Each pearl is connected to a different mythological challenge. Their first major encounter is with Medusa. The heroes initially fail to recognize the danger, but eventually discover that their host is the legendary woman whose gaze turns people to stone. Percy defeats Medusa by using a reflective surface rather than looking directly at her. The sequence demonstrates that intelligence and adaptation are as important as physical strength. The second stage takes the group to Nashville, where they encounter the Hydra. This section increases the scale of the action. After conventional attacks fail, Grover uses Medusa's severed head to turn the creature to stone. The heroes recover another pearl and continue their journey. The third pearl is located in the Lotus Casino in Las Vegas. Unlike the previous encounters, this obstacle is psychological rather than primarily physical. Percy, Annabeth, and Grover are distracted by entertainment, food, music, and the magical lotus flowers. They gradually lose awareness of their mission and of passing time. Percy eventually realizes that people have remained inside the casino for decades without understanding how long they have been there. Escaping the casino introduces urgency because the deadline for returning Zeus's bolt is approaching. The heroes travel to Hollywood and enter the underworld. This represents the story's descent into its darkest stage. Percy confronts Hades and discovers that the situation is more complicated than expected. Hades does not possess Zeus's lightning bolt and wants Percy to surrender it. The major plot twist occurs when Percy discovers that the bolt has been hidden inside the shield Luke gave him. Percy has unknowingly carried the stolen weapon throughout his journey. The revelation changes the meaning of earlier events and proves that someone has manipulated him from the beginning. Percy also learns that the pearls will only transport 3 people out of the underworld, forcing the group into a painful choice. Grover remains behind so Percy can escape with Sally and Annabeth. Persephone then turns against Hades, allowing the others to flee. The story now changes from a rescue mission into a race to prevent a divine war. Percy must return the lightning bolt to Zeus before the deadline. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief may present itself as a fast-moving fantasy adventure, but beneath its battles with monsters and encounters with Greek gods are several themes centered on identity, family, belonging, responsibility, and the transition from adolescence toward maturity. Percy's journey is not simply about returning Zeus's stolen lightning bolt. It is also about understanding why he has always felt different and deciding what kind of person he wants to become after discovering the truth about himself. Identity is the most important theme. At the beginning, Percy sees many of his personal characteristics as weaknesses. He struggles academically, has dyslexia, finds it difficult to concentrate, and feels disconnected from the ordinary world. His discovery that he is a demigod completely changes the meaning of these experiences. What appear to be limitations are partly explained as consequences of his mythological nature. His mind is connected to ancient Greek, while his unusual reflexes help him survive dangerous situations. This reversal symbolizes a broader idea about difference. A person can appear unsuccessful when judged according to an environment that does not recognize his strengths. Percy has spent much of his life believing that something is wrong with him, but Camp Half-Blood provides a setting where his abilities finally make sense. The camp therefore symbolizes belonging. It is the first place where Percy is surrounded by others who understand what it means to exist between the human and divine worlds. Water becomes the clearest visual symbol of Percy's identity. As the son of Poseidon, Percy is healed and strengthened through contact with water. Early in the film, he does not understand this connection. During Capture Flag, entering water restores his injuries and allows him to fight with greater confidence. Later, he learns to manipulate water deliberately. The progression represents his increasing acceptance of himself. Water changes from something that unconsciously protects him into a force he can consciously control. Water also symbolizes renewal. When Percy is injured or overwhelmed, it restores him. This reflects the structure of his emotional journey. Each time Percy encounters a crisis, he emerges with greater understanding. His powers are therefore more than spectacular abilities. They visually express his transformation from confusion to self-knowledge. Family is another major theme. Percy's relationship with his mother provides his strongest emotional connection to the human world. Sally has protected him for years and made sacrifices that Percy does not initially understand. His decision to enter the underworld is motivated primarily by his desire to rescue her. Although the stolen lightning bolt threatens the entire world, Percy's personal reason for accepting danger is much more intimate. He wants his mother back. His relationship with Poseidon presents the opposite side of parenthood. Poseidon is powerful but absent. Percy grows up without understanding who his father is or why he disappeared. Discovering that his father is a god does not automatically repair that absence. The film therefore presents divine parentage as both extraordinary and painful. Being the child of a god gives Percy abilities, but it also means growing up with unanswered questions. This theme extends to other demigods, particularly Luke. Luke's betrayal is motivated by resentment toward the gods and their treatment of their children. Percy and Luke can be viewed as two possible responses to similar emotional wounds. Both experience distance from their divine parents, but they react differently. Percy eventually accepts responsibility and prevents a war. Luke turns his anger outward and attempts to create one. The lightning bolt itself symbolizes power and authority. It belongs to Zeus and represents his position as ruler of the gods. Its disappearance threatens the balance between Olympus's most powerful figures. The fact that Percy unknowingly carries the bolt also symbolizes a responsibility placed upon him before he fully understands the situation. He literally carries a source of enormous power while remaining unaware of it. Luke's decision to steal the bolt introduces another theme: rebellion against authority. His actions are not presented as random evil. He believed the gods have failed their children and wants to destroy the existing order. This gives the conflict a generational dimension. The gods possess enormous power, but frequently leave their demigod children to deal with the consequences of divine decisions. The film repeatedly explores appearance versus reality. Percy's ordinary teacher is actually a fury. Mr. Brunner is Chiron. Grover is a satyr. The apparently harmless woman running a garden center is Medusa. The glamorous Lotus Casino is a supernatural prison. Luke appears to be Percy's friend, but is secretly responsible for the central conflict. The modern world constantly hides ancient mythology beneath familiar surfaces. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief uses a visual style designed to bring ancient Greek mythology into a recognizable modern world. Rather than presenting mythology as distant history, the film places gods, monsters, magical weapons, and legendary locations alongside highways, skyscrapers, casinos, museums, and ordinary American life. Cinematographer Stephen Goldblatt and director Chris Columbus create this contrast through changing environments, lighting styles, visual effects, and increasingly spectacular imagery as Percy moves deeper into the supernatural world. The opening immediately establishes the scale of the mythology. Poseidon emerges from the water before meeting Zeus on top of the Empire State Building. The scene combines a natural element associated with an ancient god with one of the most recognizable structures in modern America. The imagery establishes one of the film's central visual ideas. Olympus has not disappeared. It has moved with Western civilization and now exists alongside the architecture of the contemporary United States. Percy's ordinary life initially has a relatively grounded appearance. His school, apartment, streets, and family environment feel familiar and restrained. This gives the supernatural events greater impact when they begin appearing. The transformation of Percy's teacher into a fury is particularly effective because it occurs within what seemed to be an ordinary school trip. The film repeatedly uses this technique, allowing normal environments to reveal hidden mythological identities. Camp Half-Blood marks a major visual transition. The urban environment gives way to forests, open fields, wooden structures, armor, shields, swords, and training areas. Warm natural light and green landscapes make the camp feel separated from the darker environments Percy later encounters. Visually, it functions as a bridge between a modern summer camp and an ancient military training ground. The Capture the Flag sequence demonstrates the movie's action cinematography. The camera follows characters through the forest as teams attack one another with swords and shields. Faster editing and mobile camera movement create energy, while close shots emphasize the physical competition between Percy and Annabeth. The sequence also introduces Percy's connection with water visually. His wounds heal as he touches a stream, turning an invisible supernatural ability into something the audience can immediately understand. Water becomes the film's most important recurring visual motif. Because Percy is Poseidon's son, water is associated with power, safety, healing, and identity. The visual effects gradually become more ambitious as Percy's control develops. At first, water affects him almost automatically. By the climax, he can deliberately manipulate large quantities of it during his battle with Luke. This progression allows the visual effects to mirror Percy's character development. Medusa's garden center uses a very different visual atmosphere. Statues fill the environment, initially appearing decorative before the characters realize that they are actually Medusa's victims. The setting becomes increasingly threatening as the heroes understand what they are seeing. The numerous stone figures create visual storytelling without requiring lengthy explanation. Every statue represents someone who previously looked directly at Medusa. Uma Thurman's Medusa combines physical performance with computer-generated effects. Her moving snake hair provides the most obvious supernatural element, while framing and editing carefully control when characters can look toward her. Reflections become important to the scene because Percy cannot fight her through normal direct vision. The use of reflective surfaces turns the environment itself into part of the action. The Hydra encounter expands the scale of the creature effects. Multiple heads move independently while the heroes attempt to avoid attacks and find a way to defeat the monster. The sequence emphasizes spectacle and destruction, showing how the movie gradually increases the size of its threats. The Hydra is less psychologically unsettling than Medusa, but visually it represents the type of large digital creature expected from a fantasy blockbuster of the period. The Lotus Casino provides one of the movie's most distinctive shifts in color and lighting. Bright artificial lights, saturated interiors, crowded spaces, games, dancing, and constant movement create a deliberately overwhelming environment. The location is designed to feel attractive rather than dangerous. This is important because the threat comes from pleasure and distraction. The heroes are not imprisoned by walls. They are visually seduced into forgetting why they came. The sequence also has a music video quality that reflects the popular culture of the period. Rapid editing and glamorous lighting make the casino feel almost disconnected from the rest of the film. That difference supports the narrative because time itself operates strangely there. When Percy finally understands the truth, the exciting environment becomes unsettling. The same visual excess that initially suggested freedom begins to resemble a trap. The underworld reverses its brightness completely. Dark landscapes, fire, smoke, enormous rocky spaces, and ruined structures create an environment that feels hostile and physically oppressive. The production design combines classical ideas about the land of the dead with imagery associated with modern fantasy cinema. The scale is deliberately exaggerated, making Percy and the companions appear small within the realm. Hades is presented with imagery that shifts between humor and menace. His appearance initially avoids a traditional image of an ancient ruler, but the surrounding environment constantly reminds the audience of his power. Persephone provides another visual contrast within the underworld, bringing elegance and color into an otherwise harsh location. Mount Olympus is designed as the visual opposite of the underworld. Instead of darkness and fire, Olympus is filled with light, enormous classical architecture, open space, and monumental scale. The gods appear within an environment that emphasizes authority and distance from ordinary humanity. The scale of the architecture makes Percy look extremely small, visually reinforcing his position as a young demigod standing before beings who have existed for centuries. The film frequently uses size to communicate power. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief uses music and sound to connect two very different worlds: the ancient mythology behind Percy's identity and the energetic modern environment in which his adventure takes place. The original score was composed by Christoph Beck, whose task was to give the film the scale of a mythological fantasy while preserving the youthful momentum of a contemporary adventure. Alongside the orchestral score, the movie uses recognizable popular songs, most notably during the Lotus Casino sequence, creating one of its clearest connections to the culture of 2010. Beck's score performs several functions throughout the film. It must create wonder when Percy discovers the existence of the gods, excitement during battles, mystery during supernatural encounters, and emotion when the story focuses on Percy's family. Instead of making the entire soundtrack sound like a reconstruction of ancient Greece, the music largely follows the traditions of modern Hollywood fantasy. Large orchestral passages, percussion, dramatic brass, strings, and atmospheric textures help give the story a sense of scale. The opening confrontation involving Zeus and Poseidon immediately requires a powerful musical atmosphere. The audience is being introduced to gods who can potentially begin a devastating war, so the score establishes seriousness before Percy even understands that this conflict concerns him. The music helps communicate that the argument is not simply between two men. These are divine figures whose personal dispute could have consequences for the entire world. Percy's early scenes use a more restrained musical approach. His life initially appears ordinary, and the soundtrack allows that normality to exist before mythology begins invading it. When his teacher transforms into a fury, the soundscape changes sharply. Creature sounds, sudden musical tension, and the aggressive movement of the attack transform a familiar environment into something dangerous. Sound therefore participates in the same contrast that defines the film visually. Ordinary reality can suddenly reveal something ancient and supernatural. The Minotaur attack is one of the first sequences where sound becomes essential to the scale of a mythological creature. Heavy movement, impacts, destruction, growls, and the noise of the stormy environment make the monster feel physically dangerous. Percy's battle is chaotic, and the combination of music and effects communicates his lack of preparation. He is not yet a trained hero confidently entering combat. He is reacting instinctively to an impossible situation. Camp Half-Blood introduces another musical personality. The location represents discovery and belonging, so the soundtrack becomes more adventurous. Percy is surrounded by swords, shields, demigods, and creatures that would have been unimaginable to him only a short time earlier. The music helps transform the camp from a simple collection of cabins and training grounds into the entrance to a much larger mythological world. During Capture the Flag, percussion and faster musical rhythms support the physical action. Sword impacts, footsteps, shields, movement to the forest, and the sound of combat are emphasized clearly. When Percy reaches the water and begins to recover, the audio helps mark the change. His connection with water is not only a visual effect. The movement and force of water become part of the character's sonic identity. Water remains important throughout the film's sound design. Because it represents Percy's connection with Poseidon, its sound frequently accompanies moments when he gains control or strength. During the climax, when Percy is capable of manipulating large quantities of water, the effects become much larger and more aggressive. Rushing water, impacts, and environmental destruction turn his inherited ability into something that feels physically powerful. The Medusa sequence depends on a different kind of tension. Because looking directly at Medusa can kill, the scene requires careful control of what the audience hears, as well as what it sees. Her voice is calm and controlled, contrasting with the danger represented by the snakes and the stone victims surrounding her. This creates suspense because Medusa does not behave like a monster that immediately attacks. Her threat develops through conversation, movement, and anticipation. The Hydra encounter returns to louder fantasy action. The creature's multiple heads create a complicated sound environment involving roars, attacks, destruction, and the reactions of the heroes. The score pushes the sequence forward while sound effects provide weight to a creature that exists largely through visual effects. Without convincing audio, such a monster could feel detached from the physical environment. The Lotus Casino provides the film's most famous musical contrast. Lady Gaga's Poker Face plays during the sequence, immediately placing the scene within contemporary popular culture. The song gives the casino a playful, seductive, almost music video atmosphere. Percy, Annabeth, and Grover become increasingly absorbed in the environment, and the music contributes directly to the feeling that they have entered a place where normal responsibilities disappear. The use of a major pop song is especially effective because the danger of the Lotus Casino is not presented through traditional horror music. The environment sounds enjoyable. That is precisely why it works as a trap. The characters are surrounded by entertainment, dancing, games, food, and constant stimulation. Music becomes part of the temptation, encouraging both the characters and the audience to enjoy the sequence before its darker purpose is revealed. Other contemporary songs contribute to the movie's youthful identity. Their presence separates The Lightning Thief from fantasy films that rely almost entirely on orchestral scoring. This mixture reflects the movie's central concept. Percy may be connected to gods from ancient Greece, but he is still a teenager living in modern America. The soundtrack continually negotiates between those two identities. The underworld changes the audio atmosphere again. Darker musical textures and environmental sounds create a sense of danger and enormous space. Fire, distant voices, movement, and supernatural effects make the location feel separate from a human world. The score becomes heavier as Percy discovers that the lightning bolt has been hidden among his possessions and realizes that he has been manipulated. Luke's betrayal gives the soundtrack another emotional function. Until this point, much of the film's danger has come from monsters or gods. Luke represents something more personal. He was someone Percy trusted. The music surrounding their confrontation must therefore support both physical action and betrayal. Their final battle grows increasingly spectacular as Percy finally uses his abilities with greater confidence. Mount Olympus receives some of the score's most majestic material. The environment represents divine authority, and the music reinforces its monumental scale. After the chaos of the quest, the arrival on Olympus provides a sense of resolution. Percy has survived the underworld, defeated Luke, recovered the bolt, and reached the center of divine power. Quieter music becomes important when Percy finally speaks with Poseidon. The emotional conflict is not something that can be resolved through sword fighting or supernatural effects. Percy's questions concern abandonment, identity, and his father's absence. By reducing the intensity, the soundtrack allows the human emotions underneath the fantasy spectacle to become more noticeable. Overall, the sound of The Lightning Thief is built around contrast. Orchestral scoring provides mythological scale. Contemporary songs establish its modern teenage identity. Creature effects make digital monsters physically convincing, and recurring water sounds reinforce Percy's connection to Poseidon. The soundtrack does not attempt to recreate ancient Greek music. Instead, it translates mythology into the language of a modern Hollywood adventure. This combination gives a movie an audio identity closely connected to its era. The orchestral score aims for timeless fantasy, while the popular songs unmistakably belong to the late 2000s and early 2010s. Together, they capture the central idea of Percy Jackson itself. Ancient legends have not disappeared. They have simply entered the modern world, bringing their gods, monsters, conflicts, and heroic traditions with them. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief arrived in theaters in February 2010 with considerable expectations. The film was based on a successful series of novels, was directed by Chris Columbus and featured a cast combining younger performers with established stars. Its premise also seemed ideal for the period. A teenage hero discovers a hidden supernatural world and becomes involved in a conflict that could develop across multiple films. The response, however, was divided between viewers who enjoyed it as a fantasy adventure and critics and book fans who believed it failed to capture what made the original story distinctive. Commercially, the movie achieved moderate success rather than becoming the enormous franchise launch its producers might have hoped for. Produced for a budget generally reported at around $95 million, it earned approximately $227 million worldwide. This demonstrated that there was substantial international interest in Percy Jackson, but a performance was not comparable to the biggest fantasy franchises of the era. The results were strong enough to eventually produce a sequel, Percy Jackson, Sea of Monsters, released in 2013, but not strong enough to turn the series into an immediate annual blockbuster phenomenon. Critical reaction was mixed and negative. Reviewers often praise a movie's pace, energetic action, recognizable cast, and accessible use of Greek mythology. At the same time, many felt that the story followed a familiar young adult fantasy formula and lacked enough personality to distinguish itself from other franchise attempts. Comparisons with Harry Potter were especially common, partly because Chris Columbus had directed the first two Harry Potter films. Logan Lerman generally emerged as one of the more positively discussed elements. His performance gave Percy an approachable quality and helped audiences follow a story filled with rapid explanations about gods, demigods, monsters, and magical objects. Brandon T. Jackson's Grover provided much of the comedy, while Alexander Daddario brought confidence and physical determination to Annabeth. The supporting cast also attracted attention because relatively brief mythological roles were filled by performers such as Pierce Brosnan, Uma Thurman, Sean Bean, Rosario Dawson, Steve Coogan, and Kevin McKidd. Uma Thurman's appearance as Medusa became one of the film's most recognizable sequences. Her theatrical performance in digitally created snake hair gave the encounter a distinctive personality. The Lotus Casino was another frequently remembered section because of its bright visual style, contemporary music, and unusual concept. These scenes demonstrated the movie's ability to turn familiar myths into accessible modern entertainment, even when critics questioned the overall narrative. The largest source of backlash came from fans of Rick Riordan's novel. The adaptation changed fundamental aspects of the original story, beginning with the age of its heroes. Percy is 12 years old at the beginning of the book series, while the movie presents him as an older teenager. Annabeth and Grover were similarly aged upward. This altered the coming-of-age structure and made the film feel more like a conventional teenage adventure. The plot itself was also significantly rewritten. The search for Persephone's pearls became the organizing structure of the movie's quest, whereas the novel handled the pearls differently. Several encounters were altered or replaced. Character motivations changed, and important elements connected to the larger series were reduced. Luke remained the central traitor, but the deeper thread involving Kronos did not receive the same development that made the first novel function as the beginning of a much larger conflict. Annabeth became another focus of discussion. Fans familiar with the books noticed changes to her appearance, personality, relationship with Percy, and role within the story. The movie increased the romantic tension between Percy and Annabeth earlier than the novels did. For some general viewers, this made their relationship immediately understandable. For readers, it accelerated a dynamic that had originally developed gradually across several books. Grover was also substantially reinterpreted. Brandon T. Jackson played him as confident, humorous, and socially energetic, while the literary character initially has a more nervous and insecure personality. The change gave the movie a clear comic character, but further demonstrated that the filmmakers were willing to reshape the source material to fit a mainstream adventure formula. Rick Riordan's own dissatisfaction later became an important part of the movie's reputation. His criticism of the adaptation strengthened the perception among readers that the film had moved too far from the spirit and structure of his work. Over time, this became almost inseparable from discussions of The Lightning Thief. The movie was no longer judged only as a fantasy film. It became an example frequently mentioned when audiences discussed how Hollywood adaptations can alienate the readers who supported the original material. This raises an important distinction between reception as a movie and reception as an adaptation. Someone with no knowledge of the novel could watch The Lightning Thief as a straightforward fantasy road adventure involving teenagers fighting Greek monsters across modern America. The story has clear objectives, regular action sequences, comedy, recognizable mythology, and a complete ending. A reader approaching the same film could focus instead on missing characters, alter motivations, compress mythology, and changes to the long-term story. Audience reaction, therefore, remain complicated. Some viewers who first encountered Percy Jackson through the movie developed considerable nostalgia for it. Logan Lerman became closely associated with Percy for an entire generation, and scenes such as Medusa's lair, Capture the Flag, the Lotus Casino, and the final water battle remain memorable. For these audiences, criticism of the adaptation did not necessarily eliminate the entertainment value of the film itself. The movie was not a major awards contender. Its ambitions were primarily commercial and entertainment-driven, rather than aimed at prestigious dramatic recognition. Its visual effects, production design, and cast were designed to support a franchise adventure, and the film's lasting discussion has focused far more on adaptation choices and awards. The eventual release of a second film proved that the first movie retained commercial value. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief developed a legacy far more complicated than its original theatrical performance suggested. Released in 2010, the movie was intended to introduce audiences to a new fantasy franchise based on Rick Riordan's popular novels. It achieved enough commercial success to produce a sequel, but the film series never reached the scale of Harry Potter or the other major young adult franchises that followed. Despite this, The Lightning Thief remained culturally visible for years because of its cast, its modern interpretation of Greek mythology, the continuing popularity of the books, and the controversy surrounding its adaptation choices. The most direct part of its legacy was Percy Jackson. Sea of Monsters, released in 2013. Logan Lerman returned as Percy, Alexander Daddario returned as Annabeth, Brandon T. Jackson returned as Grover, and Jake Abel again appeared as Luke. The sequel attempted to expand mythology and introduce additional characters and concepts from the novels. However, it did not perform strongly enough to guarantee another theatrical installment. As a result, the film series ended after only 2 movies. This was particularly significant because Rick Riordan's original Percy Jackson and the Olympian story consisted of 5 main novels. Audiences who experienced the story only through the films therefore never received a cinematic conclusion to Percy's larger conflict. Characters, prophecies, relationships, and mythological threats that develop extensively in the books were either compressed or never reached the screen. The unfinished series became part of the Lightning Thief's reputation. During the 2000s and 2010s, Hollywood repeatedly attempted to transform successful young adult novels into multi-film franchises. Some became enormous successes, while others disappeared after 1 or 2 installments. Percy Jackson became an important example of how recognizable source material and a large production budget did not automatically guarantee a long-running film series. The movie's relationship with the books also created a lasting lesson about adaptation. Many of the changes made in 2010 appear designed to make the story more immediately cinematic. The characters were older, romantic tension was introduced earlier, the quest was simplified around the search for pearls, and the adventure moved quickly between major action sequences. These choices made the movie accessible to audiences unfamiliar with the novels, but they weakened elements that were important to the larger series. Aging Percy was especially consequential. The novels allow readers to watch him grow from a 12-year-old child into an older teenager over several adventures. Starting with an older Percy removed much of that progression. If the movies had continued for many years, the filmmakers would have had less room to reproduce the original coming-of-age structure. This became one of the clearest examples of how an adaptation decision made for a single film can create problems for an entire planned franchise. The Lightning Thief also influenced the public image of its younger actors. For many viewers, Logan Lerman became the face of Percy Jackson. Even after the film series ended, images of Lerman with riptide or surrounded by water remained strongly associated with the character. The role helped establish him internationally before he moved into acclaimed projects such as The Perks of Being a Wallflower and Fury. Alexander Daddario experienced a similar effect. Annabeth was one of her earliest major movie roles and introduced her to a worldwide audience. She later became significantly more famous through films and television, but Percy Jackson remained an important early part of her career. Brandon T. Jackson's energetic interpretation of Grover likewise remained memorable even though it differed considerably from the books. The film also left behind several individual sequences that developed nostalgic value. The Lotus Casino became perhaps the clearest example. Its colorful visual style, endless party atmosphere, magical lotus flowers, and use of contemporary pop music made it strongly associated with the early 2010s. For viewers who watched the movie as children or teenagers, the sequence often became one of the first images recalled when the film was mentioned. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The lightning thief produced an unusual relationship with its audience because different generations and groups experience a movie in very different ways. For some viewers, particularly those who had never read Rick Riordan's novel, it was an exciting introduction to a world where Greek gods and monsters secretly existed inside modern America. For established reader, however, the experience would be frustrating because characters, relationships, ages, and major parts of the story had been changed. This division became central to the way audiences remembered the film. When The Lightning Thief appeared in 2010, many younger viewers encountered Percy Jackson through the movie rather than the books. To these audiences, the basic concept was immediately attractive. Percy begins as an apparently ordinary teenager who feels uncomfortable at school and uncertain about his place in the world. He then discovers that his differences have an extraordinary explanation. He is the son of Poseidon and belongs to a hidden community of demigods. This fantasy of discovering a secret identity strongly resonated with younger audiences. Adolescence is often a period in which people question who they are, where they belong, and why they feel different from others. Percy experiences those feelings in an exaggerated mythological form. His confusion becomes a heroic origin story. Instead of simply struggling to fit into the ordinary world, he discovers that he was never entirely part of that world in the first place. Camp Half-Blood became particularly important to this interpretation. It represents a place where Percy's differences are normal. The qualities that cause difficulties in school no longer define him as unsuccessful. He meets other people with similar experiences and discovers abilities he never knew he possessed. For younger viewers who had experienced feelings of isolation or academic frustration, the idea of finding a community where previously misunderstood qualities became strengths could be especially appealing. Percy's relationship with his mother also gave audiences an emotional connection that did not depend on mythology. Sally is the person who protected Percy throughout his life, and her apparent death during the Minotaur attack changes the adventure from simple discovery into something personal. When Percy learns that she may still be alive, rescuing her becomes more important to him than following the expectations of Camp Half-Blood. Many viewers interpreted this as one of Percy's defining qualities. He does not become heroic simply because he discovers supernatural powers. He becomes heroic because he chooses to risk himself for people he loves. His loyalty to his mother, Grover, and Annabeth gives emotional meaning to the action sequences. The relationship between Percy and Poseidon created a different emotional response. Poseidon is powerful enough to command the sea, but has been largely absent from his son's life. This contradiction makes divine parentage less ideal than it initially appears. Percy gains extraordinary abilities from his father, but those powers do not erase years of absence. Some audiences saw the final meeting between Percy and Poseidon as emotional, while others felt the film resolved their relationship too quickly. Luke provides a darker interpretation of the same problem. He also feels abandoned and neglected by the gods, but his anger becomes destructive. Audiences can therefore interpret Percy and Luke as two responses to parental absence. Percy wants answers, but ultimately protects others. Luke turns his resentment into revenge and attempts to provoke a war among the gods. For fans who entered the theater after reading the books, the emotional response was often very different. They already possessed clear ideas about Percy, Annabeth, Grover, Luke, Camp Half-Blood, and the larger mythology. Seeing older versions of characters immediately changed the tone. Events that readers expected were removed or rewritten, while relationships that originally developed slowly were accelerated. This created one of the most common experiences associated with adaptations, the conflict between expectation and reinterpretation. A viewer unfamiliar with a novel could judge whether a scene was entertaining. A reader might instead compare every decision with a version already imagined while reading. The same sequence could therefore produce excitement in one audience and disappointment in another. Annabeth became particularly important in this divide. Movie audiences could understand her as a confident warrior and potential romantic interest for Percy. Book readers knew a more complicated character whose intelligence, ambitions, family history, and gradual relationship with Percy developed over several stories. The film's faster approach made the character accessible but reduced some of the qualities readers considered essential. Grover generated a similar reaction. Brandon T. Jackson's version was energetic and comedic, and many viewers enjoyed his humor. Readers recognized that this was a substantial reinterpretation. Yet over time, even some critics of the adaptation developed affection for performances themselves. This distinction became increasingly common. Audiences could dislike the changes while still enjoying individual actors. Nostalgia eventually transformed the film's reputation. Children and teenagers who watched The Lightning Thief in 2010 grew into adults with memories attached to specific scenes. The Lotus Casino, Medusa's Garden Center, Capture the Flag, the Minotaur attack, and Percy's water powers became associated not only with the story, but with a particular period of childhood entertainment. Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief builds its character development around discovery, loyalty, abandonment, and the choices people make when confronted with power. Although the film moves quickly between action sequences, its central characters each represent a different response to the unusual world of demigods. Percy begins as a confused teenager with little understanding of himself. Annabeth seeks experience beyond Camp Half-Blood. Grover wants to prove himself as protector, and Luke transforms personal resentment into rebellion. Their individual journeys give the adventure its emotional structure. Percy undergoes the clearest transformation. At the beginning, he feels disconnected from the world around him. School is difficult. He struggles to understand why he is different, and his family situation leaves him frustrated. He loves his mother, Sally, but cannot understand why she remains with Gabe, whose unpleasant behavior makes their home uncomfortable. Percy has no idea that Sally has deliberately kept him close to Gabe because his presence helps disguise Percy's supernatural scent from mythological creatures. His first encounters with mythology force him to reconsider everything he believes about himself. The Fury attack reveals that monsters are real, while the Minotaur attack destroys any possibility of returning immediately to ordinary life. Percy's apparent loss of his mother becomes the emotional shock that pushes him across the boundary between his old existence and his new identity. At Camp Half-Blood, Percy's development initially comes through knowledge. He learns that Grover is a satyr, Mr. Brunner is actually Chiron, and the Greek gods continue to exist. Most importantly, he discovers that he is a demigod. This revelation gives meaning to experiences that previously seemed like personal failures. His differences are connected to a world he never knew existed. The Capture the Flag battle turns this knowledge into physical confidence. Percy begins a sequence inexperienced and vulnerable. Annabeth easily demonstrates that she understands combat better than he does. Once Percy comes into contact with water, however, his injuries heal and his strength increases. His identity as Poseidon's son becomes undeniable. From this point onward, Percy's relationship with his powers develops from accidental discovery toward conscious control. His motivation remains deeply personal. Percy does not leave camp because he dreams of becoming a legendary hero. He wants to save his mother. This distinguishes him from a character motivated primarily by glory. His willingness to disobey instructions and enter the underworld reveals both impulsiveness and loyalty. Those qualities repeatedly place him in danger, but they also explain why other characters choose to follow him. Annabeth Chase begins from almost the opposite position. As the daughter of Athena, she already understands the mythological world and has extensive combat training. Percy needs knowledge, Annabeth needs experience. Camp Half-Blood has prepared her to fight, but she wants the opportunity to participate in a real quest. Her early relationship with Percy is competitive. During Capture the Flag, she treats him as an inexperienced opponent and tests his abilities. Their dynamic gradually changes as they travel together. Percy proves that his lack of training does not mean he lacks courage, while Annabeth demonstrates that her confidence is supported by intelligence and discipline. The film also introduces romantic tension between them relatively early. Their attraction remains secondary to the quest, but it changes their relationship from simple rivalry into a developing emotional connection. By the end, Annabeth no longer sees Percy merely as the inexperienced newcomer she defeated at camp. He has become an equal companion who has survived the same dangers. Grover has a different arc centered on responsibility. He is initially presented as Percy's humorous best friend, but the revelation that he is a satyr changes the meaning of their relationship. Grover has been protecting Percy, and his friendship is connected to a serious duty. His comedy frequently hides the pressure attached to that responsibility. Throughout the quest, Grover proves that he is more than comic relief. He fights alongside Percy and Annabeth, confronts supernatural threats, and ultimately demonstrates his loyalty in the underworld. When the heroes discover that they have only 3 pearls for 4 people, Grover volunteers to remain behind so Percy can escape with Sally and Annabeth. This is the strongest moment in his arc, because the character who frequently jokes about danger willingly accepts the greatest personal risk. Luke Castellan represents the darker side of demigod identity. When Percy first meets him, Luke appears experienced, friendly, and helpful. He provides Percy with information and equipment, and behaves like an older figure who understands the difficulties of being the child of a god. This makes him valuable to Percy, who has only recently entered the mythological world. The revelation that Luke stole Zeus's lightning bolt completely changes the audience's understanding of him. His helpfulness was partly manipulation. The shield he gives Percy secretly contains a stolen bolt, making Percy an unwitting carrier. Luke intends to use a conflict between Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades to provoke a larger war. Yet Luke's motivation is rooted in genuine resentment. He believes the gods neglect their children and deserve to lose their authority. This makes him an important contrast to Percy. Both young men have reasons to feel abandoned by divine parents. Percy is angry and confused by Poseidon's absence, while Luke has allowed similar emotions to develop into hatred. Their final confrontation is therefore more than a physical battle. Luke represents a possible future Percy could choose if resentment became stronger than loyalty. Percy rejects that path. He may not forgive every failure of the gods, but he refuses to allow innocent people to suffer because of those failures. Percy Jackson in the Olympians. The lightning thief uses costume and set design to support its central concept. Ancient Greek mythology still exists, but has adapted to the modern world. Instead of placing the characters in a historical recreation of ancient Greece, the film combines contemporary clothing and locations with armor, weapons, temples, statues, and mythological environments. This mixture helps distinguish Percy's ordinary teenage existence from the hidden supernatural society he gradually discovers. Percy's clothing begins in an intentionally ordinary way. He dresses like a contemporary teenager, allowing him to appear completely disconnected from the heroic figures of Greek mythology. This is important because the story depends on Percy's transformation. He does not initially look like a legendary warrior. His appearance communicates that he belongs to modern America, making the later addition of swords, shields, armor, and supernatural abilities more striking. At Camp Half-Blood, costume design begins combining modern youth culture with ancient military imagery. The campers do not dress as historically accurate Greek soldiers. Instead, recognizable camp clothing exists alongside leather protection, metal armor, helmets, swords, bows, and shields. This creates a world that feels like a summer camp transformed into a training ground for mythological warfare. The orange Camp Half-Blood clothing is particularly useful as a visual marker of community. Percy has spent much of his life feeling different, but at the camp he becomes part of a larger group of young people who share his unusual heritage. The costumes, therefore, do more than identify a location. They visually communicate belonging. Annabeth's appearance reflects her role as an experienced fighter. Her clothing allows physical movement and supports the character's confident, practical personality. During combat training, she looks comfortable carrying weapons and confronting other demigods. This immediately separates her from Percy, who enters the camp without comparable experience. Costume becomes a simple way of showing who already understands this world and who does not. Grover provides a different design challenge because his true form must combine a human upper body with satyr characteristics. Before Percy learns the truth, Grover appears largely ordinary, helping conceal the mythological world. Once his identity is revealed, His appearance becomes part of the film's mixture of contemporary personality and ancient creature design. He remains recognizably the same humorous friend even after Percy understands that he is not human. Chiron requires an even more ambitious transformation. Pierce Brosnan first appears as Percy's teacher, Mr. Brunner, using a wheelchair. At Camp Half-Blood, the disguise disappears and he is revealed as a centaur. His costume and physical appearance retain the dignity of the teacher, while the visual effects create his horse body. This transformation symbolizes the movie's larger design principle. Familiar people and places often conceal mythological identities. Camp Half-Blood itself is one of the most important sets and locations. Forests, cabins, training areas, weapons, banners, and open spaces create a settlement that exists between an American summer camp and an ancient warrior community. The natural environment gives the camp a timeless quality. It feels removed from the modern cities Percy knows, but not so removed that the young characters appear to have traveled into another historical period. Medusa's Garden Center is one of the most imaginative examples of production design. At first, the location can be understood as a strained commercial property filled with statues. Once the heroes discover Medusa's identity, every statue acquires a disturbing meaning. They are not decorative objects, but people who look directly at her and were turned to stone. The design therefore tells part of the story before dialogue explains everything. Human figures are frozen in different poses throughout the environment, creating both visual humor and horror. Medusa herself is designed to appear elegant rather than immediately monstrous. Uma Thurman's appearance gives a character sophistication, while the digitally created snakes transform that beauty into something threatening. The Lotus Casino represents the opposite design philosophy. Instead of creating fear, it is designed to overwhelm the characters with pleasure. Bright lights, luxurious interiors, games, food, crowds, and fashionable clothing make the location feel exciting and limitless. Nothing about the environment initially suggests imprisonment. This is essential because a casino traps people through desire rather than force. The design creates a place where visitors would willingly remain. The constantly active environment gives Percy and his friends little reason to think about the outside world. When they realize that time has passed differently, the same colorful location becomes unsettling without needing a major physical transformation. The underworld allows the production design to become much darker. Fire, stone, smoke, enormous spaces, ruined architecture, and masses of souls create a hostile realm separated from ordinary life. The environment draws from familiar cinematic images of hell, while incorporating the Greek mythological idea of Hades as a kingdom of the dead. Hades himself is given an unconventional appearance. Rather than dressing exclusively like an ancient king, the character has a theatrical, almost rock star quality. This fits Steve Coogan's humorous and eccentric performance. The design deliberately avoids presenting every god according to traditional classical imagery. These divine beings have survived into the modern era, and their appearances reflect that modernization. Persephone provides a strong contrast to the harsh underworld. Her clothing and presentation emphasize beauty, elegance, and sensuality within a location dominated by darkness and death. The contrast makes her visually distinctive and supports the film's playful interpretation of the relationship between Hades and Persephone. Mount Olympus provides a grandest set design in the movie. Where the underworld is dark and oppressive, Olympus is open, luminous, monumental, and ordered. Huge classical structures evoke ancient Greek temples, but their impossible scale makes the location feel divine rather than historically realistic. The gods themselves are presented in clothing that suggests classical mythology without attempting strict archaeological accuracy. Their costumes communicate status and timelessness. The purpose is not to convince viewers that they are watching ancient Greece. Instead, the designs create instantly recognizable versions of divine rulers within a modern fantasy film. Scale becomes one of the most important design tools during the Olympus sequence. Percy appears small against enormous architecture and the presence of the gods. The environment visually communicates the power difference between a teenage demigod and the divine figures whose conflict has driven the entire story. Weapons and props also help connect the ancient and modern worlds. Percy's sword, Luke's shield, the winged shoes, Zeus's lightning bolt, and other objects carry mythological importance, while functioning within contemporary action scenes. Riptide is especially significant because the sword becomes a physical symbol of Percy's movement into the heroic world. The lightning bolt is designed as more than an ordinary weapon. Its appearance communicates concentrated supernatural power, making it believable that possession of the object could threaten the balance among the gods. Luke's shield performs the opposite function. It appears to be a useful gift, but secretly conceals the stolen bolt, making a familiar heroic object part of betrayal. The movie sets become increasingly extraordinary as Percy advances through his journey. He begins in ordinary schools, apartments, streets, and museums. He then enters Camp Half-Blood, travels to locations hiding mythological threats, descends into the underworld, and finally reaches Olympus. Production design therefore mirrors the expansion of Percy's understanding. Costume and set design ultimately reinforce the idea that mythology has never disappeared. It has simply changed its clothing and found new places to hide. Ancient warriors train in a modern camp. Medusa operates among statues in contemporary America. Temptation takes the form of a Las Vegas casino, and Olympus rises above Manhattan. This combination of recognizable modern environments and classical imagery gives the lightning thief much of its visual personality. The designs are not attempting historical authenticity. Their purpose is to make mythology accessible, energetic, and contemporary. Through clothing, weapons, architecture, creature design, and contrasting environments, the film constructs a world in which a teenager can leave an ordinary school one day and stand before the gods of Olympus only a short time later. The screenplay of Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief, was written by Craig Titley and faced a difficult adaptation challenge. Rick Riordan's novel contains extensive mythology, numerous characters, a cross-country quest, mystery surrounding Percy's identity, and important foundations for later books. The movie needed to communicate enough of this material for newcomers to understand the world while maintaining the pace expected from a fantasy adventure. As a result, the screenplay favors direct exposition, humor, action, and easily understood character motivations over the slower development of the novel. Percy's dialogue initially establishes him as a contemporary teenager rather than a traditional mythological hero. He does not speak formally or behave as though he is destined for greatness. His reactions to supernatural discoveries are confused, skeptical, and occasionally sarcastic. This keeps the mythology accessible because Percy asks many of the same questions that an unfamiliar audience would ask. When he learns about demigods, satyrs, centaurs, and Greek gods, the explanations are effectively being delivered to Percy and the viewer simultaneously. This approach makes exposition one of the screenplay's most important tools. Chiron and Grover frequently explain the rules of the mythological world. They tell Percy who his father is, why monsters are pursuing him, what Camp Half-Blood represents, and why the stolen lightning bolt matters. The information is necessary, but the quantity of exposition reveals one of the adaptation's difficulties. A complex fictional world that can be introduced gradually across chapters must be established rapidly on screen. Grover's dialogue is designed to prevent these explanations from becoming too serious. Brandon T. Jackson receives many of the screenplay's comedic lines and reactions. His version of Grover is more confident and outspoken than the character from the novel, allowing him to function as both Percy's protector and the movie's principal comic relief. Jokes frequently appear immediately before or after dangerous moments, reducing tension and keeping the overall tone suitable for a broad family audience. The humor also emphasizes a collision between ancient mythology and modern culture. The characters may be discussing gods who have existed for thousands of years, but they speak like contemporary young people. This contrast is central to the film's identity. Rather than attempting to make the dialogue sound mythological, the screenplay treats legendary figures as part of everyday modern reality. Annabeth's dialogue establishes confidence and competitiveness. When Percy arrives at Camp Half-Blood, she understands the world far better than he does and frequently speaks from a position of experience. Their early conversations contain rivalry, curiosity, and hints of attraction. The screenplay develops romantic tension much earlier than the books, using teasing and competitive exchanges to suggest that their relationship could eventually become more than friendship. Their conversations also change as the quest progresses. Percy initially depends on Annabeth for knowledge, while she underestimates his lack of training. After Percy survives several encounters and learns to use his powers, their exchanges become more balanced. The dialogue therefore supports a movement from rivalry toward mutual respect. Luke is written differently because his dialogue must work on two levels. During the first half of the movie, he appears relaxed, helpful, and sympathetic. He understands the frustrations of being a demigod and provides Percy with equipment for the journey. Nothing in his manner immediately identifies him as the central human antagonist. This friendly style is important because the later betrayal depends on Percy trusting him. After Luke reveals the truth, his dialogue becomes more openly resentful. He explains his anger toward the gods and his desire to create conflict among them. The screenplay gives him a recognizable motive rather than presenting him as evil without explanation. He believes the gods are selfish parents who ignore their children and should be punished. His words transform the final battle into an ideological conflict as well as a physical one. Percy has reasons to understand Luke's anger. Poseidon has also been absent from his life. The difference is that Percy refuses to accept Luke's conclusion that destruction is justified. The screenplay therefore uses their confrontation to express one of the story's central moral questions. How should children respond when powerful parents fail them? The dialogue involving Sally Jackson is more emotional and grounded. Sally seems established that Percy's family relationship matters before the mythological quest begins. Her conversations with Percy communicate affection and protection, while her interactions with Gabe show the unpleasant domestic environment Percy wants to escape. Once Sally is taken, earlier dialogue gains greater importance because it establishes why Percy is willing to risk entering the underworld to recover her. The gods are given dialogue designed to communicate personality quickly because most have limited screen time. Zeus speaks with authority and impatience, reflecting his position as ruler of Olympus. Poseidon is more restrained, particularly when he finally speaks directly with Percy. Hades is sarcastic and theatrical, matching Steve Coogan's interpretation of the character. Persephone's dialogue adds humor and reveals tension within the underworld. The marketing campaign for Percy Jackson and the Olympians. The Lightning Thief faced a clear challenge. The film needed to introduce a fantasy universe to audiences who had never read Rick Riordan's novels, while convincing existing readers that the characters they loved could become the foundation of a major movie franchise. Released in February 2010 by 20th Century Fox, the film was promoted as a large-scale fantasy adventure combining Greek mythology, teenage heroes, monsters, comedy, romance, and modern American locations. One of the campaign's strongest advantages was the popularity of the Percy Jackson books. The Lightning Thief had already developed a substantial young readership, giving the studio an existing audience. The marketing could therefore emphasize the familiar Percy Jackson name, while also presenting the concept in simple terms for newcomers. The gods of Greek mythology are real, their children live among humans, and one teenager has discovered that he is the son of Poseidon. The trailers concentrated heavily on this revelation. Percy begins as an apparently normal teenager before learning that his entire understanding of reality is incomplete. Promotional footage emphasized the transformation from ordinary life into mythological adventure. Audiences saw Camp Half-Blood, sword fighting, monsters, supernatural powers, the underworld, and Mount Olympus. The campaign sold discovery as much as action. Percy's connection to water became one of the most useful promotional images. Water immediately communicated his relationship with Poseidon and provided visually spectacular material for trailers and television advertisements. Shots of Percy controlling water suggested that he was not simply another teenager carrying a sword. He possessed a recognizable supernatural power that could become part of the film's visual identity. The title itself required careful positioning. In the United States, the film was released as Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief, closely connecting it with the larger book series. In some international promotion, the title was simplified to Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. In either form, the words Percy Jackson became the central franchise identity, while the Lightning Thief identified the individual adventure. Posters commonly place Logan Lerman's Percy at the center, emphasize his role as a young hero. Mythological imagery, dramatic skies, water, weapons, and supporting characters communicated fantasy without requiring audiences to understand complete mythology. The visual campaign needed to make the movie recognizable beside other effects-heavy releases, so spectacle was prioritized over the quieter coming-of-age elements of the story. The supporting cast also provided substantial marketing value. Pierce Brosnan was internationally recognized as a former James Bond. Uma Thurman was famous for Pulp Fiction and Kill Bill. Sean Bean had appeared in The Lord of the Rings, while Rosario Dawson, Steve Coogan, Catherine Keener, and Kevin McKidd added further recognizable names. Advertising could therefore appeal to parents and adult moviegoers, as well as the younger audience attracted by Percy, Annabeth, and Grover. Chris Columbus was another valuable promotional element. His connection to the first two Harry Potter films made him particularly relevant to a new fantasy adaptation aimed at younger audiences. Marketing references to his previous work helped communicate the type of experience audiences could expect. Young characters discovering a hidden world, learning extraordinary abilities, and confronting dangers larger than themselves. At the same time, comparisons with Harry Potter created a difficult expectation. Any fantasy film involving young heroes, magical environments, unusual mentors, and a potential series of sequels risked being viewed as an attempt to reproduce the success of that franchise. The Lightning Thief therefore benefited from Columbus's reputation, while also needing to establish that Greek mythology gave Percy Jackson a separate identity. Trailers emphasized recognizable monsters to accomplish this. Medusa was particularly valuable because audiences did not need knowledge of the books to understand that she was a famous mythological figure. Uma Thurman's snake-covered hair created an instantly identifiable image. The Hydra, Minotaur, Centaurs, and other creatures similarly demonstrated that the movie's fantasy came from Greek legends rather than conventional world of witches and wizards. The campaign also highlighted humor. Grover's dialogue and reactions appeared prominently in promotional material, presenting the movie as an adventure that did not take itself too seriously. This was important for attracting families and younger viewers. The threat of war among the gods provided dramatic stakes, but comedy suggested that the experience will remain entertaining rather than excessively dark. The film's contemporary music and youthful tone strengthened its appeal to teenagers. The Lotus Casino sequence was especially useful in establishing that Percy Jackson was not a historical mythology film. Ancient legends existed alongside Las Vegas nightlife, modern fashion, cars, popular music, and recognizable American culture. The entire marketing concept depended on this collision between the ancient and the contemporary. The theatrical release date also influenced promotion. The movie opened in February 2010 during a competitive period, and notably arrived alongside other high-profile releases. The studio needed the Percy Jackson name, fantasy spectacle, and family appeal to distinguish the film in a crowded entertainment market. International promotion was especially important because the story's mythology could be recognized far beyond the United States. Percy Jackson, the Olympians. The Lightning Thief could be understood more clearly when compared with Rick Riordan's original novel, other young adult fantasy adaptations, and the earlier work of director Chris Columbus. The film arrived in 2010 when Hollywood was actively searching for fantasy franchises capable of attracting the enormous audiences that had embraced Harry Potter. Although Percy Jackson possessed its own mythology and identity, the movie was inevitably compared with Harry Potter and later became an important reference point for discussions about faithful literary adaptations. The most important comparison is with Riordan's 2005 novel, The Lightning Thief. Both versions follow Percy Jackson as he discovers that he is a demigod and the son of Poseidon. Both include Camp Half-Blood, Annabeth, Grover, Luke, Medusa, the underworld, Zeus's missing lightning bolt, and Percy's complicated relationship with his divine father. However, the film changes the structure and tone significantly. The clearest difference is Percy's age. In the novel, Percy begins his adventure at 12 years old. The movie presents him as an older teenager, with Logan Lerman already in his late teens during production. Annabeth and Grover are similarly aged upward. This changes the nature of the story. The book is about a child entering adolescence while discovering a frightening new world. The film is closer to a teenage action-adventure with stronger romantic possibilities. This decision affects the entire potential series. In the books, Percy's gradual aging is important because readers watch him mature across several years. His emotional development, friendships, responsibilities, and romantic feelings evolve alongside his age. Starting the film series with older characters compresses that coming-of-age journey before it has properly begun. The quest itself is also substantially different. The film reorganizes the middle of the story around finding Persephone's 3 pearls. Each pearl becomes an objective connected to a major adventure sequence. This gives the screenplay a simple structure: locate the pearls, enter the underworld, rescue Sally, and escape. The novel does not structure the quest in the same way. The pearls become important later rather than functioning as a treasure hunt that directs the entire journey. From a cinematic perspective, the movie's approach creates an easy progression and clear destinations. From an adaptation perspective, however, it changes the logic of Percy's journey and removes several events that contribute to the book's larger mystery. The treatment of the main villain represents an even more important difference. Luke is revealed as a lightning thief in both versions, but the novel establishes a much larger threat involving Kronos. Luke's betrayal is not simply an isolated rebellion. It is connected to a conflict that will develop across the entire book series. The movie reduces this element, making Luke's plan more immediate and self-contained. This creates a stronger ending for a standalone film, but a weaker foundation for a long franchise. The novel concludes one mystery, while opening the door to a much larger war. The movie focuses more strongly on defeating Luke, returning the bolt, and preventing immediate conflict among the gods. Annabeth is also noticeably different. Riordan's version is defined by intelligence, ambition, strategic thinking, complicated family experiences, and her connection to Athena. Her relationship with Percy develops slowly from rivalry and friendship towards something deeper. The movie makes their attraction more obvious much earlier. Alexander Daddario's Annabeth is also presented as a highly capable fighter, and the capture the flag sequence establishes physical competition between her and Percy. This works effectively for an action movie, but some of the characters' intellectual identity receives less emphasis than it does in the novels. Grover undergoes an equally substantial transformation. The literary Grover can be nervous, insecure, and deeply concerned about proving himself as a protector. Brandon T. Jackson's movie version is more confident, humorous, socially comfortable, and energetic. The change gives the film a reliable source of comedy, but it creates a noticeably different character. Comparisons with Harry Potter were unavoidable. Both stories feature young protagonists who discover hidden supernatural identities and enter secret communities where they learn about powers, monsters, rules, and dangerous enemies. Both also use adult mentor figures and friendships among young heroes as central narrative elements. Chris Columbus strengthened these comparisons because he had directed Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone and Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Yet his approach to Percy Jackson is noticeably different. The first Harry Potter film spends considerable time allowing the audience to discover Hogwarts, its traditions, classrooms, teachers, and everyday life. The Lightning Thief moves through its world much faster. Camp Half-Blood does not become the central home of the film in the way Hogwarts dominates Harry Potter. Percy arrives, receives basic training and information, and soon leaves on his quest. The result is a more mobile adventure. Harry Potter emphasizes immersion in a magical institution, while Percy Jackson emphasizes a journey through modern America.